The Trump administration today doubling down on its policy of forcibly separating children from their parents at the border. Former First Lady Laura Bush, in an extraordinarily rare rebuke of a policy and a sitting president, accurately describes the Trump policy as, quote, warehousing children in converted box stores, and writes, quote, I live in a border state. I appreciate the need to enforce and protect our international boundaries, but this zero-tolerance policy is cruel, it is immoral, and it breaks my heart. She adds, these images are eerily reminiscent of the Japanese-American internment camps of World War II, now considered to have been one of the most shameful episodes in U.S. history. Former CIA Director General Michael Hayden goes even further, comparing these scenes at the border to Nazi concentration camps, tweeting, quote, this is Birkenau, then Germany, now Poland. No one who now walks through that portal on that siding can casually believe that civilized behavior is guaranteed. In response, the Trump administration deflecting blame, but owning the hardline policy.
Immigration is the fault in all of the problems that we're having, because we cannot get them to sign legislation. We cannot get them even to the negotiating table. And I say it's very strongly the Democrats' fault. You see about child separation. You see what's going on there. But just remember, a country without borders is not a country at all. We need borders. We need security. We need safety. They could be murderers and thieves and so much else. So we want a safe country. And it starts with the borders. And that's the way it is.
Or they could be infants torn from their mother's arms. We'll hear how the press secretary answers questions on this any moment. But first, to get us started, NBC's Jacob Soboroff is outside the Border Patrol's Central Processing Center in McAllen, Texas, where he's been doing remarkable reporting on this story from the beginning. White House reporter for the Washington Post, Ashley Parker, joins us. And here at the table, MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele, former chairman of the RNC, Eli Stokols, White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times, and Doug Thornell, a former senior advisor for the DNC. Because we started with Laura Bush, let me start with you, Michael Steele. As a sitting First Lady, Laura Bush rarely engaged in policy or politics, and at the depths of George W. Bush's least popular hours as president, her public approval remained, I think, in the high 90s. Yeah. So she has influence, and she uses her voice very rarely. What did you think when you saw her comment?
I thought it was a very powerful rebuke, and I thought it was a very profound moment in terms of national Republican voice, that given all the folks who have titles and positions in Washington and around the country, hers as a former First Lady stood out the loudest and the strongest and, quite honestly, the bravest to push back what is a reprehensible policy. And it spoke in a way that reminded us of how strong she was as a First Lady, going back to those dark days you were talking about in the Bush term when the numbers weren't there. But also why she had so much respect, because she would oftentimes in critical moments bring that mother, that sense of a woman, a parent, and someone who has a soul to a particular situation, as she did with her comments today.
Ashley Parker, I think the other way to describe it is she spoke to America's humanity. And I remember after 9/11, she was the first figure who went out. She went on television the next morning and talked to parents about how to talk to their children about not being afraid. Hers was the first voice that we presented to the country the morning after 9/11. I wonder if there's a single person that you've come in contact with in the White House who has any discomfort with what's happening at the border.
Yes, they do, or some of them do. And if you sort of watch everyone in this White House's, even their public comments quite carefully, you see that they are trying to not break with the president, who has a very tough on immigration line, but also trying to reflect their own kind of personal view, because as Laura Bush articulated so well, it's not just an issue of politics or policy, but one of moral conscience. And so you do have some people going out there, even publicly, and kind of saying, you know, you even saw the First Lady, for instance, saying that families should not be separated from their children. Parents should not be separated from their children. You saw Kellyanne Conway, counselor to the president, publicly trying to hedge a little bit and saying that, no one really thinks this is a good idea. Of course, that's not purely true. There are some people in the administration who also, conversely, both publicly and privately, will say this is a good idea. This is the rule of law. This is working as a deterrent. So it is mixed, but this is an incredibly difficult issue for them on a level of, again, politics, policy, and humanity, and it's something they're all grappling with, how to handle it.
Jacob Sobroff, you've moved from the facility to the border. Tell us the story of the human toll, obviously the most important part of this story.
Look, what I saw yesterday, Nicole, and that's what stuck with me, is the inside of this processing center at the McAllen Border Patrol station. This is the epicenter of where this is all going down. The conversation that's happening back in Washington so often is disconnected from the reality and the facts on the ground. And the ground in this instance is McAllen, Texas. This is the place that has the most Border Patrol apprehensions. They happen right there at the Anzalduas Bridge behind me almost every single day. And by the virtue of the traffic that comes through here, that means the most child separations are now happening here. And we're looking at some of those pictures, on the screen of the Mylar blankets and the cage fences. I mean, this conversation about there are no cages, I'll tell you right now, there are cages. I saw them with my own eyes, and they look like dog kennels, and there's no other way to describe them. There are children that are alone in them, and there's an increasing number of children alone in them as a direct result of the Trump administration policy to separate children from their parents. And it's not only putting these children in HHS facilities on their own, taking parents and putting them in federal prison, but it's putting a stress on the staff at these centers. And that's what Border Patrol agents are telling me. There were 4 social care workers in this one center where we're looking at the cages on the screen, and that's 4 social care workers for kids that are left alone by their parents, and it could be in the hundreds, and that number's only going up. It is a building crisis in slow motion, real time.
Jacob, can you debunk a few things that are swirling around on social media and other places? There are people asking, where are the girls and where are the youngest children?
We can't tell you for sure because the Department of Health and Human Services, which actually administers the shelters, has only let us into 2, one in El Cajon, California, and the other one over in Brownsville, about an hour away from here where I was late last week. And the one in Brownsville was only boys between the ages of 10 years old and 17 years old. And the one in El Cajon was also young boys for the most part. At least that's what NBC News saw when we went in there. So the Health and Human Services, which by all accounts offers pretty good service to these children in pretty respectable facilities, just hasn't been as transparent as we would like them to be. And granted, they're dealing with an influx of people. 11,000 kids plus are in their care right now, and that number's only going up. But the world wants to know, where are the toddlers that this program is separating? Where are the young girls that this program is separating? We have not seen them. I've seen the boys with my own eyes, but I haven't seen the girls and I haven't seen the toddlers, and nobody's let me get in to see that yet. Something
else I've seen in some of the coverage is that they're not permitted to touch these children. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true, and this is all very complicated because these kids are effectively incarcerated, and the rules, even if they're in a shelter by name, are bound by certain strict policies, and one of them is one that's designed to protect children from sexual assault when they're incarcerated. And so that policy was never designed to be administered in a scenario where children are separated from their parents as a matter of systematic policy by a presidential administration. So when you have little kids that are ripped away from their parents and their caregivers can't give them a hug or pick them up, or even change their diaper if that's something that they need, because of a policy designed for something completely different, you get into this situation like the one that we're in right now, at which, again, by all accounts, including medical professionals, it will create extreme trauma that lasts for a lifetime in these kids. It was a sickening thing for me as a father of a 2.5-year-old to be inside that facility yesterday and see these little kids and know that some of them may sit there for 24 hours before they're picked up and their parents are gone to go to Health and Human Services.
Jacob, stay up with us and jump in if we stray from any of the facts. I think we should stay on the facts. They're appalling enough, and we hope Sarah Huckabee Sanders will have some answers in our hour, and we'd like your help fact-checking all that. But Eli, let me read a little bit more of Laura Bush's piece to you. She writes, "Americans pride ourselves on being a moral nation. on being the nation that sends humanitarian relief to places devastated by natural disasters or famine or war. We pride ourselves on believing that people should be seen for the content of their character, not the color of their skin. We pride ourselves on acceptance. If we are truly that country, then it is our obligation to reunite these detained children with their parents and to stop separating parents and children in the first place. That is the opposite of what is happening. What Jacob just described is the incarceration of children, and children whose diapers aren't getting changed because they're being treated like criminals who they can't touch.
Right, and the people in this administration who are defending this policy don't want to acknowledge the fact that these are children. They talk about this in very clinical terms. They talk about this being a matter of law and order. We're enforcing the law. These laws have been on the books for a long time. They don't want to focus on the children. There's something important, though, to notice here. This is not a president, obviously, who has been moved or has really seemed to care about carrying the mantle of moral leadership that has defined this presidency throughout history up until the 45th president. He hasn't been moved by claims of, we're America, we need to lead, set an example for the rest of the world. But he is a president who, maybe more than any of his predecessors, is a media figure, a television president. This presidency has been compared to a television show. And if anything is capable of moving them to relent, you already see the president changing his story. First, it was the Democrats' fault. He also said today, well, we're doing this because we don't want the influx of migrants that we've seen in Europe. He's starting to change his story. And if anything will, I think, move this president and this administration and perhaps Republicans in Congress to come up with a solution, it's the fact that all of this is now being broadcast wall to wall on television. People are seeing the images. It's harder to ignore the fact that we're talking about really young kids here. And I think, even some of the statements that were sent out today, Ben Sass, Republican senator from Nebraska, he included that still image of that little girl next to the car in tears. So did John Kasich in his statement. Republicans, people who are opposed to this policy, they appreciate the power of images to change the narrative, to affect change. And this president, for all the things we say and we know about him, he definitely is susceptible to what he knows is the prevalent media narrative on television and reactive to that oftentimes.
But, Doug, he's not reactive to the facts. And the fact is, this is not the law. This was a policy announced by Jeff Sessions a few weeks ago to start separating children. This is not the law.
No.
The laws haven't. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, Nicole, not only that, but the basis for this policy, which he's denying is even a policy, he's just not correct. He tweeted out today, we don't want the violence spilling over into the United States. I'm paraphrasing. We don't want the violence that's happening south of the border spilling over into the United States and terrorizing us like it is on the south side of the border. And there's no doubt that Mexico is extremely violent. In fact, it had its most violent year ever. But if he took the time to read the reports from his own drug enforcement agency, the DEA, he would know that they've said year after year, spillover violence is not a considerable problem that happens in the United States. So to use that as justification for incarcerating little children, separating them from their parents, is just simply not based in fact. It's something that he made up and he put on his Twitter account today.
Yeah, and I think part of that is his effort to try to desensitize the public, in particular his supporters, to these images that we are seeing more and more so on TV. And that's, he does a very good job when he needs to. He does it against the media. When the media is coming after him, he makes them into fake news. He goes after the Mueller investigation. All of these people who could be a threat to Donald Trump, he tries to demonize. And that's why he talks about these kids in these ways, right? They're almost like these, it's almost like they're, in a very inhumane way, they're almost like animals.
Well, he's trying to almost make it so the public can't distinguish between these children and the MS-13 gangs. He goes to Long Island and talks about there being bloodstained killing fields on Long Island.
Here's where you get tripped up, Ashley Parker. His voters are skeptical about the Russia investigation. They're skeptical about the media, but they are not stupid. And they still have eyes, and they still have families, and they still have kids. This feels to me like the kind of story that might make them choose between what is apparent to their own eyes and what's coming out of the president's Twitter feed.
I think that's a great point, and we'll have to see. But in talking, for instance, one lens to view this through is in talking to Democrats before we saw this crisis. Democrats would say that immigration was, for instance, a tricky issue for them, especially in some of these House districts. There were constituents who did like what the president was doing, say, on MS-13 or his rhetoric on sanctuary cities. When you voted for President Trump, someone who introduced the Muslim ban during the campaign, you were getting someone who used tough, harsh, offensive language on immigration, and people liked it. In talking to them since this crisis, it seems that this may be the one blanket issue on immigration where it just goes too far. In those images, in these stories, they cut across party lines, and even some of the president's loyal supporters are coming out and saying this isn't right. And so, again, we don't know still exactly how this will play out and if the president will change his tune, but I think you are right in that this may be one of these rare galvanizing issues where President Trump can no longer defy political gravity.
I want your thought on that. I want to give you two more things to respond to, though, from me. New York Times reporting that for George W. Bush and Barack Obama, the idea of crying children torn from their parents' arms was simply too inhumane and too politically perilous to embrace this policy. Just more evidence that this is not the law. This is a Trump choice. And then let's talk about that. But I also want to show you Kirstjen Nielsen. I mean, this is Secretary of Homeland Security, I guess, rapidly responding to Laura Bush. Let's watch.
For many in the press, in Congress, and advocacy groups over the last few weeks, that we at DHS are intentionally doing things that are unhumanitarian, that are cruel, immoral, and disgraceful. We are doing none of those things. It is important to note that these minors are very well taken care of. Don't believe the press.
I'm sorry. How about believing
you?
Or how about our own eyes? I mean, you know, Laura Bush or Secretary Nielsen. I'm going to go with Laura Bush. Our government should not be in the business of warehousing children in converted box stores or making plans to place them in tent cities in a desert.
Okay, so don't believe the press reports. And as our colleague Jacob has been out there and reported, I believe last week, gave us the narrative of being informed by the officials there to smile at the children so that way you can show them they're not animals. Okay, so if they're not
they don't feel like animals in cages, Michael, that's what they said. Exactly.
Thank you. So if that's what the press is being told when they're coming in to take a look at these facilities, to smile at the children so they don't feel like they're animals in cages, what does that tell you about the situation these kids are in? That the people who are overseeing this would think that those kids will get the impression that they're animals in cages.
Jacob, you want to try to answer that?
All of that?
Yeah.
Look, on top of all of that, it doesn't matter. As one official said to me, it doesn't matter if you put these children in a 5-star hotel on a Caribbean island. After they're separated from their parents, which is what this policy is all about, they're going to have trauma that lasts a lifetime. You could have them at Disneyland every single day. You could do whatever they wanted, was their favorite thing in the world. But being ripped from your parents when you're a minor is not something that you will ever forget.
That's exactly right. Jacob, let me follow on that with a quote in the Washington Post from a pediatrician making a similar point to the one you're making, who says inside a room dedicated to toddlers was a little girl no older than 2, screaming and pounding her fists on a mat. One woman tried to give her toys and books to calm her down, but even that shelter worker seemed frustrated, Kraft told the Washington Post, because as much as she wanted to console the little girl, she couldn't touch, hold her, pick her up, and let her know that everything would be all right. That was the rule. They're not allowed to touch the children. Your broader point is even if they change the rule, what these children want is their mothers and fathers.
At the end of the day, by the way, this system has been in place during the Obama administration as well. It was put into place as part of a court ruling, and this is not the first time people have been unhappy with this system. The system itself should be reformed. I heard from a former Obama administration official that told me it's fair game to criticize HHS and the way that they care for the children and the situation that they put themselves in, but it's immigration policy that puts them into those shelters, and Donald Trump today has put the most extreme piece of immigration policy that we've probably seen when it comes to young children, possibly ever, in place that's forced them into these shelters and exacerbated every problem that has ever existed in these shelters before today. And like I said, not just during his administration.
So, Eli, I've asked this question after Charlottesville. Who quits? I've asked this question at other points in the administration. Who resigns? You think anybody quits over this policy? You think there's a parent who can't fathom what their policy is doing to these children? You think there's any mother or father of a child who says, I can't be a part of this, and walks out the door?
There may be, but so far we've asked that question before, as you point out, after Charlottesville especially, and we haven't seen anybody quit and protest.
Why not?
I wouldn't hold your breath. Well, I think people decide that they're going to work for